It's thinking, all the anticipation. And we are live.
Excellent. Wow. Look at all these lovely faces. Thank you everyone for being here. We are so pleased to welcome today's panel, moderated by Melissa Milton-Pung of the Michigan Municipal League. We will learn from Michael O'Brien, Mark Defolk, and Jacqueline Austin about policy's role in placemaking and the shift to placekeeping as a way to engage the residents of different communities. Each of these people has an impressive background that deserves to be shared, but I know you also want to hear as much as possible from them in this session. So learn more about each of them, open up a new browser tab and read their bios in the speakers section of the lobby or down below this video. So without further ado, take it away, Melissa.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here with you at the Lansing Placemaking 6. I've attended many years in the past and enjoyed many of the conversations that have occurred here. I'm delighted to be joined by our panelists here today. And we have put together a series of questions that we can discuss our way through. The first question that we're going to begin with is, what roadblocks have you faced during this time for policy and creative placemaking in the past or now? What misunderstandings have you seen between policymakers, artists, and others involved in creative placemaking? Perhaps we can start alphabetically. Let's start with Jacqueline Austin, and then we'll go to Mark Folk, and then to Michael O'Brien.
Okay. So I run the Bright Walls project here in Jackson, which is large-scale murals and public art in our town. We've installed 40 murals in the last 3 years. And we started out with a very interesting, our city manager at the time was kind of renowned for saying no, particularly to murals. And there was a pretty hefty mural approval process that we were actually only the second group to ever get through the whole process. And so we made it one of our missions to make sure that we followed processes and worked directly with the city. So when we went into this project, we knew that we had to have a good plan for what we wanted to do and proving to the city that it was worth their time and effort to support us in that. So we actually took a lot of time searching through the master plan, finding out where our project would fit in specifically and how that impacted the community as a whole, and particularly the downtown area, which has been in a revitalization over the last, I'd say, 6 to 10 years, and how our project would fit in with that. So we were really very specific on making sure that we were following the policies that were in place. If we were having problems with the policies, how we could streamline those for future groups and for other groups to be able to get through. And then making sure that we were working, the city was one of our major partners on the project, and making sure that they, sorry, my dog, making sure that they were supporting us 100%, which they have because of the research and work that we did in the background.
You inventoried what were your challenges and then figured out how to go around them or to alter them on the landscape.
Yeah, so we were specifically looking at the master plan was probably our biggest tool because it had recently been redone by the city. So we could point to specific things that they wanted to do and how we could help them get there.
Very cool. Mark,
yeah,
what can you share with us on the question here of what roadblocks have you seen in creative policy placemaking between policymakers, artists, and others?
I would go back a little bit further kind of to the origin story of creative placemaking, which was actually a policy shift in and of itself in the NEA under Rocco Landesman to actually create an expanded amount of fundability and across and outside of the arts budgets, which are relatively small, and getting into bigger pools like transportation and accessing the ability to fund livability and quality of life. I think that that policy shift at the national level caused a big national shift without an articulation on what the goals were to be and how they would be measured. And then the first rounds of funding we saw go out were really high visible, splashy projects that were really about creative placemaking, less than creative placekeeping. And as the field evolved, the policy of individual foundations and how they use the language of creative placemaking to drive our organizations and our endeavors to meet their priorities. I think we've just in the last several years really seen funding start to meet the need of what the field has for the creative placemaking dollars instead of being bent to the will of the funding source. So that's been a big issue for I think many of the smaller communities or mid-sized communities across the country. As far as policy locally, we can get into this account in the conversation a little bit more. We went through a process of engaging our neighborhoods around our downtown, which are post-industrial, low-income, largely neighborhoods of color, in a strategic planning process, as we were finding that city and foundation policies weren't willing to support these efforts until there was a formal plan that had been adopted by the city itself in our plan commission.
Good point. Indicating that you're trying to shape those funding streams to help you then qualify for the work that you need to do to work with the residents who are in your community.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. Now, Michael, how can you bring your experience to bear in this question?
Yeah, so one, thank you for having me. Really a pleasure to be on the panel and with my colleagues here and talking about, I think, what's a really super relevant conversation, particularly in the context of the way that communities and people are having to respond to everything happening right now. I'm in Philadelphia. I've lived here for 17 years. I came here and did undergrad and just stayed because I love the city. I've been on the artist end. I've been in the policy advocacy side. I've been on the project conception and management side. I've worked with city government. I've worked with city government, a couple other places. And I think what's interesting about Philly, and when I say other places, I mean other parts of the country, and they're interested in this subject matter. And what's interesting about Philly is I think Philly can serve as a marker for people in a good way and in a challenge-based, informative way. So to Jacqueline's point, there's no struggle getting a mural on a wall here. Like that, we've been doing that for 30 years, plus years, right? And even the work that was taking place prior to the creation of the mural arts program and mural arts advocacy program, was birthed out of work of the Anti-Graffiti Network, which came out of work in the 70s, right? Like this energy here has been around for a very long time. So you won't really get a pushback on getting a mural up somewhere. I mean, there's still a journey to it. You got to make sure you have the developer on board and there's the wall space and all that. But the challenge I think that our city still suffers from is understanding the role of the artists and the creatives in this context that goes beyond community engagement, which really starts to look at outcomes around social cohesion and addressing a variety of health and life outcomes and an issue or issues around inclusion. So when you start talking about placekeeping, inclusion of history, inclusion of indigenous history, transitioning histories, thinking about and considering the tensions of the shifts that are taking place and how that's impacting people's health. And so sometimes it is difficult to get people to understand the role that the arts and the artists can play in opening up the access for participation in those kinds of conversations and thinking about interventions and preventions that aren't necessarily centered on art, but can utilize creative methodologies and practices to further those conversations and dialogues to really reimagine the way even that evaluation looks when trying to or measurement looks when trying to understand public health data and subject matter or issues around how transportation is impacting the livelihood of folks. So there are some folks that get it. There are some folks that still need that education process, but just, I think it's an interesting thing to lift up that regardless of how successful the art projects become and the acceptance of the art projects, become, there are these larger things that we're still working to get people to understand from a policy perspective and not have the arts be considered ancillary or cute or extra curricular, but core to moving these health and human-centered measures forward and impact forward.
Yeah, you're not just building the building and putting some architecture on it. You're baking it right in to those core plans. You're talking about in terms of how the challenge may be different in each community, but understanding that creative methodology, as you stated, bringing that problem solve to trying to carry out that authentic work was really a good lesson to have learned here. Thank you. Moving on to the next question that we have here, I think that it's important for us to consider how are we carefully, respectfully, and authentically working with vulnerable communities and communities of color. You've referenced this a little in your previous remarks, Michael. How are we doing this across the work we're doing for each of the communities that we're working in? Let's go backwards with Michael and then Mark and then Jacqueline.
Right.
Sure. I think, from a systems perspective, so it's a little context to the answer I'm going to give. I take a, developmental science-based approach to a lot of my work, like arts, music, theater, writing, et cetera, are my core. But, I don't think the arts don't exist in a vacuum. And there was a time in our human history where the arts and sciences were all wrapped in one. And some of the greatest thinkers that the West lifts up were these polymaths. And it's only in the 21st century that we've really gotten so siloed and putting things in this category and that category over there, and the two may never meet. So all that being said, for me, the answer that I'm going to give you takes into consideration like developmental science, history. It takes into consideration anthropology, like the progression of the species, all of that. So quick couple of statements in that space. Vulnerability is an outcome of a series of choices in policy and decision making. Policy, both formal and informal. So formal policy, things that are legislated, written down, voted on. It's in a handbook. It's in an employee handbook, right? These are things that bodies that have been vested a certain kind of structural and institutional power have the ability to set, create, and maintain. Informal policy are things like not paying women equally to the work that men do. It's not legislated or written down anywhere, but it is so widely practiced that you can do tons of research, and there has been tons of research on this trend over decades, right, worth of time. And so in the space of formal and informal policy, vulnerability is an outcome of choices that have been made out of those spaces. And, I think about that as not being, as a personal thing. I think about communities then are not vulnerable because of some inherent trait called vulnerability, right? Or some inherent set of things that they're born with as a human being that create vulnerability. They have been made to be.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again? Because that's really important to emphasize here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So humans are not born vulnerable based on any inherent set of characteristics that come with the human package. These are social constructs and policy constructs that have been, again, these are decisions that have been made over time, and they have accumulated and now have created risk factors that people are born into based on, we can do that research based on zip code is the real popular thing happening right now in public health policy and population health policy and research. And so with that consideration, I then go, well, this isn't about vulnerability anymore to me. It's about exclusion, right? These are excluded populations. These are populations that have been excluded from the thought of posterity through policymaking, from the thought of well-being through policymaking. And the question for me in the context of the work, both as an artist, as a creative director on these projects, et cetera, and then doing the advocacy work and working alongside policymakers is who is over-centralized? Often we go like, who's left out? Sometimes I take the reverse approach. Who's over-centralized? Whose voices are always heard? Who's always given the focal point? Who does policy always prop up? Whose well-being is policy typically, centering? And with that acknowledgement, then we can do the opposite and start to center something else, someone else, center narratives that get excluded, center context and experience that gets excluded. And so for me, that's how we start to make sure that the quote unquote vulnerable or excluded populations have a role of centrality. But again, and I'm going to stop here. I center on the need to be clear with that language, because vulnerability assumes some type of potential inferiority, right? Or assumes some type of potential lack or deficit. Like, we're starting with a deficit-based lens that's typically often used as a characteristic put back on the population, versus starting with an excluded population, which is not about a deficit, it's about things around them that have pushed them to the side. And so it allows us the opportunity to also start with assets, right?
Yeah.
We can acknowledge the systemic barriers, but also start with assets from that community or individual. And that's a lot of how I center the work to make sure that people are included and that they're not left on the margins in the work.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent point, rebalancing populations that have been disenfranchised versus those which have been given a fast track to assets.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, can you jump in with some comments on this topic?
Related to, I mean, I totally agree with Michael and the philosophies around vulnerability and the importance of social determinants of health and the quality of life for all communities. On the practical side, I think, putting into practice the need to do a plan to be eligible to get some of the resources and to meet the demands of capacity and policy. When we launched a strategic plan for arts and culture, we broke down, we didn't hire an arts firm to do that. We hired a community development individual and an AmeriCorps worker. And then we identified 8 communities in our central city, 2 of which were doing placemaking. It downtown, uptown, there was nothing there. But to build agency and to self-identify assets in the other 6 neighborhoods around downtown, which were originally suburbs, the original suburbs of the city, which all were propped up at one time and benefited from being able to walk to manufacturing jobs and employment, which were now largely low-income neighborhoods of color, that if the downtown pace kept going, they would be, they could be just rolled over through gentrification. We asked to be guests. I think that's a value that's incredibly important. Asking to be guest and then listening. If you want someone to show up to your house, you should be willing to go to theirs. And we facilitated conversation around asset mapping and how you're connected to culture, how you're not. Our staff sat in the office and didn't say anything. And then we used that content to inform the overall plan, but not only that, created individual neighborhood reports and that planning process, so those communities had the agency to go after funding on their own and could have their capacity to do so endorsed by a bigger plan that was ultimately adopted, and then really began that long work that, if so much of creative placemaking is tied to larger social and economic issues in the community. It uses art as a process. And again, to Michael's point, the artistic output of creative placemaking is a document or a product. The real work is in the process that happens between the start of the creative process, and that's the power of the arts in this work, towards completion. And is an organization that's wants to have real relationships. And let me just color a little bit the Toledo scenario. At the same time as we were launching this work, our entire community development corporation structure collapsed. So we went from 13 CDCs to 1 to none, kind of right now. And so we morphed into that role to meet a community need as a cultural CDC in this work, and then began the long process of building authentic relationships. And that, to be honest, takes, at least 3 to 5 years. And then you still have to understand your boundaries in that space. So I think this authenticity to community, the importance of the creative process, in its role and that social cohesion, the developing the sense of belonging. And then really, I think we'll get into this in a minute with a couple questions, but as arts professionals, even if we are integrated, as Michael talked about, in our reasoning and our understanding of science and economics, we don't have the skill sets to deal with some of the larger social issues that are happening in our communities, and we need to build those partnerships so we can facilitate, opportunities to help community in infant mortality, or job opportunities. And it's really our communities are really complicated places, especially those that have suffered from multi-generational disinvestment.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. I'm hearing a lot from you with regard to that process is our product in many ways, and that's what we talk about. My organization, the Michigan Municipal League, we've been doing a lot of work with community wealth building and talking about not only what are the different components of community wealth, but also how are they bound together with sense of belonging and access and trust. I love what you're talking about there, because it seems like this is a trend that is turning in so many of our different everyday lives, and how are we oriented work that we're doing either through nonprofit work, service, or mission-oriented business. I'm seeing that there is probably a connection to what Jacqueline is doing in Jackson as well, and I'm hoping that you can add in a few comments on this question about how are we authentically and respectfully engaging those who are in communities of in vulnerable populations, or those, as Michael has pointed out, are perhaps disenfranchised.
Yeah, so we focus ours on accessibility and making sure that our festival is accessible to all. So we've made it one of our cornerstones that everything in our festival is free, and we offer assistance when needed. So, for example, we don't have any vendors in our festival other than food vendors. We do allow food vendors to charge any fees. We invite the community to come out and provide services for the festival. So, for example, the Sunday of our festival is always Family Day, and we have organizations from around the community that come out, and they're able to set up a booth, talk about what they do in the community, but they also have to provide something back to the attendees of the festival. So there has to be some sort of interactive activity that allows for kids to learn about art, or the parents to do something with their kids, things like that. And so we want it to be very interactive and everybody find a place that they fit. We also do things like education. We have an education day where we invite schools to come out and do field trips at Bright Walls. And we know that that's a tough thing for some schools to be able to do financially. So we offer grants and we cover their busing or other fees that might be associated with that. We make sure that we're covering the fees for everything. We also focus really hard on diversity with our artists and the art that we choose. We always make sure that our art fits with our community and fits with where our community is in the current times and what the history of our community is. But we also make sure that we find artists that are of different backgrounds, different experiences from around the world, so that anybody coming to the festival or coming to look at these pieces can see themselves in that position and can find inspiration in something that they may be able to aspire to in the future, or where they want to be in their lives and how that can help build them up.
Visual and non-visual representation, because if you look at each individual on the call, you can see how they appear to be, but then you do not know what they have lived through, what experience they've brought to bear. I like what you're talking about in terms of providing a variety of different types and kinds of people who are carrying out this work and providing this vital service without having a barrier or a roadblock for people to participate. Let's move on to the next question, and I'll remind those who are watching here today, we've worked on these questions together as a group, and we know where we're going next with this conversation, which is how do we, in the role of practitioners of creative placemaking, how do we participate in supporting the homeless population in our communities? Or do we even think that placemaking has a role in supporting the homeless population in our community? Jacqueline, you want to go? We can work our way through. It's kind of a back and forth situation.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have much experience in this. I know that placemaking does focus on creating safe spaces and activating spaces. That's where my specialty is. And as far as directly connecting that to homeless, I don't have a ton of experience in that, but I do know that by creating safer spaces and creating opportunities for advancement in the policies and changing policies so that they can be accessible to those that can help in that arena is very important.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of what we've done at the Michigan Municipal League for placemaking over the years, we're looking back on our work and we've seen the intent that we had to carry out that work. We're not necessarily seeing some of the unintended effects of creating exclusion on the landscape in many instances for different segments of our population. For homeless folks, though, I think that perhaps a lot of people are perhaps invisible in the community because you don't necessarily know that people are experiencing housing instability. I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. If there's another perspective you'd like to bring to this conversation.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Or nothing, Mark.
Oh, Mark. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you were still addressing me.
Well, I mean, sure. It's a huge issue. With again multi-generational disinvestment. Our communities are effectively designed they were designed to function in a way that's not a reality anymore. And we're probably in the part of the post-industrial Midwestern belt, has gone through decay, and I think we moved into composting, which is an important part of the fertilization process. But we're left with a tremendous amount of social issues to face, and I think that's one of the challenges, to be completely honest, about creative placemaking, that we're drawn into incredibly complex social issues like homelessness, where there are entire sectors in our communities to deal with that haven't been able to resolve the issue. And to put that onus on art practitioners is really it's a big challenge. I think that we have a role in making marginalized communities visible. I think we have a role in creating a sense of belonging and social cohesion, and really helping elevate the visibility of these systems. But this is one of many places where we need our partners in the social service sectors to really lean into the work. And we need, one of the things that I'm excited about being a person and working in Toledo, because we're in a moment here where the leaders of our organizations are aware that we all need to reach above our mission or out of our silo and work collectively on more complex social issues. And I think that the only way, things like homelessness or addiction, or, I could go on down the list, are going to get dealt with is if we create a new form of community fabric where we all lean into the bigger issues instead of staying in our own space.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like you're alluding a little bit to economic dignity, or to the ability for people to feel that they are participants in the community, no matter what their socioeconomic status is. I used to work for Washington County for a very long time, and in the Office of Community and Economic Development, we would carry out the homelessness point in time count on one of the coldest days of every winter to see who was outside without a choice, because there are many people who do have other supports around them to carry on, at least without having it be that visible. It was an experience and an eye-opening experience. And part of that was, where have we shut people out in our community? Where have we shut people out in the programs and that we have available? And how does that interface with the good work that's happening in other sectors? So I hear, Mark, what you're saying is not only is it our role to help elevate the who are on the front lines doing that work, but also how do we improve the importance of that conversation when we're talking about it related to all the other work that we're doing in our community, and not necessarily make that work something that is separate from what we're doing here. So thank you for that. Michael, I heard you, or I saw you nod your head on a couple of different issues. Did you want to respond to or bring with some of your thoughts here?
Yeah, sure. So, I think just echoing Mark about the leaning in factor is really important. I think also the context also matters, right? I think it's important that we recognize, and I appreciate Mark also bringing up addiction, right? That it's not that people are homeless, it's that they're experiencing homelessness, right?
Very good point.
right? People aren't addicts. They might suffer from addiction, but they're humans that are suffering from addiction. And what's, I think, taken place in our society is a process over time of dehumanization, which makes it easier to reason about the subject matter and the people meshed in one, and then the people become the problem. And people are not problems to be solved. People are humans to be loved, to be supported, to sometimes be challenged, right? But like in general, they're people to build relationship with, because it is through relationship. We're social organisms. It is through relationship that we actually learn, grow, and build trust to learn and grow and to make changes. But any kind of change that I'm going to be making in my life is there's a predecessor to that, which is that I have to have a series, or at least one, stable, safe relationship. And so I don't think we can do anything with addressing these issues without recognizing people's humanity first, and the ways that society, again, has compromised their humanity and then left the onus and burden on them. It doesn't mean that I don't believe in the concept of personal responsibility, but I don't believe in it off the rails where everything is personal responsibility. That's just not true for us biologically, psychologically, socially, developmentally, the whole nine. So with that context, I think it is about how do we want to show up on behalf of other human beings? How do we want to show up in relationship to other human beings? Do we understand the lenses that have been put forward for us to imagine through, particularly in government, right? This is about desirables and undesirables. Government plans, typically in municipalities, are about limiting the view and access of view to people experiencing homelessness. The plans are about clearing out areas. The plans don't panhandle, right? Like there are all these methodologies and ways, even creation of foundations out of like business district organizations to handle panhandling. It's wild what we'll surmise and come up with as a solution, but it's never centered on the humanity of the folks that are experiencing the issue at large. Don't get me wrong, there are some local areas in the country that are trying some things, but overarchingly, fundamentally, this is the challenge. As a practicing artist and, social practice artist and someone that's worked in this space, I've worked on projects that directly address the issue of youth housing insecurity and young adult housing insecurity, including the experience of homelessness. There's a project I was lucky to be a lead artist on. There were about 5 or 6 of us as lead artists here in the city. It was during the same time where I ended up managing and chairing the Youth Point in Time count for Philadelphia. It was the first time back in 2014, I believe it was. It was the first time that the federal government was mandating that anyone receiving money from HUD had to conduct a Youth Point in Time count. But that nature of the way point in time counts work and the nature of the way that youth housing insecurity looks, you're not really going to go out and count young people on the street. That's not the way that they...
The random core sample,
homelessness. So there was a lot of learning and doing that we all had to do. But like as an artist, I can speak to the point of like standing at the intersections of these spaces and places because I wanted to lean in, because I wanted to do work and bring art to spaces and places where people had been dehumanized and learned how to build expertise in that area. It took time, right? I entered that field at 21, this intersection of art, public health, and the experience of housing insecurity for families and children and young adults. And by the time we did the point in time count, I was now 7 years in with an arts practice still, but also now having built up relationships in city government, built up policy advocacy experience, understanding of trauma from both a clinical perspective and a very deep science perspective. But it was about the choice to lean in and build network and relationships along that whole way, keep showing up as an artist, and the opportunity to think about where data comes from. Lived experience is a kind of data that we don't like to take into consideration, but it is so important. And artists have methodologies to source that out and then do some sense making out of that space with the people experiencing the issue, and then communicating that back, right? And very visceral, emotionally provocative, and very straightforward, and sometimes sideways, methodologies to policymakers, to foundations, to a variety of stakeholders. And Yeah. So all that, just some thoughts and like just an idea around, there's a website too, Journey, the number 2, and then home. So journeytohome.org. We've left it up. The program, it originally was like 6 months worth of funding. It turned into the 18-month long project. Then we were out, just sharing about the work and what happened. But the infrastructure of that project allowed us to pay young people, give jobs. I mean, it was fascinating how it kept growing. And again, it's centered at the intersection of creative placemaking, policy advocacy, working with policymakers. We were able to work with or to influence a then candidate who became city council member during the process, who during her first 3 months held a hearing on the issue of youth housing insecurity, and for the first time got a line item into the budget around this issue, right? So have seen it work, have also seen it not push far enough. But the fact of the matter is artists can stand at these intersections, and to just underscore Mark and finish out here, it's how deep you want to lean in and how much network you want to invest in building.
Well, it's also to the same point about giving that dignity, that seriousness, that methodology. Just like if you were to say, come to a downtown development authority and say, we need to talk about public-private partnerships, they wouldn't bat an eye. What if you were to go and just say, we need to talk about empathy? What? We need to start talking about how are we serving our residents? How are we thinking about the human experience, people who are walking through our district, who are there through a variety of different means, but who all have the right to be there? And how can we shift our business and what we are doing to serve each of those? And that's not much skin off your nose. That's actually increasing the economic base because you're serving more people. Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you. Any comments on this topic from our panelists, or would we like to move on to the next question?
I think we can talk about all these things for an hour apiece, so we should probably move on to the next topic.
All right. Well, it is somewhat similar in that we are talking about how are we working with those as opposed to at those. How do you engage residents in the communities being gentrified and not those just doing the gentrification? Now, somewhat like climate change, we're not defining whether or not, we're not questioning whether or not it's happening. We know that in markets, they change. Gentrification occurs, it is a fact. How do we engage those residents and communities that are being gentrified and not those that are doing the gentrification? And what does that practically look like? What are some practical things that we can do? We're gonna switch again back and forth. So we'd like to go with Michael and then Mark and then Jacqueline.
Yeah, my thoughts here might be a little controversial, but
we have these jam sessions at the league as well. We're like, do we really be like, no, who else is going to say this unless we do?
Right.
We're holding the mic here.
Yes, I appreciate that. So gentrification is a market force. It's a part of the process of being in a metropolitan or urban area that is engaging in development work. It's not if gentrification is going to take place. It's really about when and where and what the life cycle is on that process. Mm-hmm. None of that actually means, though, that displacement has to happen at the rates that it does. Erasure has to have, like, those are choices, right? Gentrification does not have to include those things. But because of the haphazard ways that we go about the work, it does include those things. And those are, again, these are choices. There's so much we love to chalk up to like random market forces. And I'm just like, that's not true. That's not true. Poverty, for example, is not a random market choice. Poverty is an emergent property. It is the result of choices and decisions that were made. It's a choice to not hire, equally. It's a choice to not pay women equally. It's a choice to, practice unfair lending. It was a choice to redline. It didn't have to be done. People thought about it, made a choice, and then decided to go along with it. And like, we have to sit in that reality. And so I think that's part of the nature of gentrification is like, it doesn't have to look the way that it does. We have made choices. We have to sit in the fact that we made those choices. And now those are the, precedents were set. That's like the guidebook that people are using now to just keep replicating the harms that have already been present. Now, the flip side is, I think in working with people, it's to acknowledge history is here, people are here, they have a variety of thoughts and opinions about needs, assets, challenges, about new people coming in, about the way developers are interacting with them. I think it's about making space for those voices. And again, there are so many creative methodologies to do that. Making timelines, visualizing them, putting them in very public spaces and places, allowing people to add to it. Rules like you can't take away anything that you didn't add, but you can always add context to other places. There's so many ways to engage people in some of the placekeeping stuff that's passive. And then there's much more in-depth, engaged, story circle centered work, and using all kinds of media to create installations and exhibits that can be living in our museum. I'm talking from quick examples of things that we've done at the place where I work, the Village of Arts and Humanities, where we've built multimedia exhibits on a 50-year history of a court, basketball court, and the people's varying journeys with the space as the gentrification thing is looming in the region. So there are all kinds of ways to do that. But I think the point is like the choices that we're making, and government acting as if they're not part and parcel to that and spurring that is, I think it's very dishonest and disingenuous.
Yeah, planning with, not planning at, helping provide those tools for self-authorship for community members. Looks like Megan's joined us. Thank you for being part of this.
I know that nobody wants this to end. You're right. This could go on for an hour on each topic. It's been very great to listen to all of you, and this has been really exciting to hear this dialogue. And really, I don't want it to end, but unfortunately, it does have to come to an end so that we can move on before the time just runs out on us. But I'm really seeing a lot of great conversation that you're having about the choices that we make as leaders that affect populations that are choices. They are choices, and the things that we can do to better those the things that we make in the work that we do, to make the gentrification not happen. So I really appreciate that all of you were able to come today. I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to ask questions. And so remember that the chat is going to have a little bit of a delay, but does anybody have any questions in the chat real quick?
We need like game show music right now.
While we're waiting for some of the questions to roll in, are there responses that either Mark or Jacqueline wanted to have a question about gentrification?
I start with an assumption that people want to stay in low-income situations, and the fact that I think we need to be providing economic opportunities to the extent possible, to provide a form of upward mobility. And if there's investment coming into community, that the people that are living there have the chance to benefit from that investment. If a developer is moving forward on a project, that a homeowner in that neighborhood gets a share of that project. So if it cashes out, they have upward mobility as well. And I do want to hold up the importance, we've gotten into some complicated issues here. Jacqueline's worked through Bright Walls and making sure that the communities are made visible in murals so people from different backgrounds can see themselves in the urban landscape is an incredibly powerful tool as well, to work towards cohesion and inclusion, and maybe even open up the pathway for shared conversation moving forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great example also of connecting artists with the communities that they're in. I think that that's just such a phenomenal thing when that happens authentically. So please speak to that.
Yeah, as far as the gentrification topic, I would say that one of the things that our project is helping to do is keep our downtown accessible to others with having the free public art that people can come and enjoy and not have any barriers to it. Like I said, our downtown is in a revitalization, and you can easily see how adding new buildings and new apartments and things like that can make it seem like it's only for certain demographics or a certain income level or things like that. And so having opportunities for people to come and enjoy the downtown that they can do on their own or do in a way that they can connect to, I think is really important.
Fantastic. Well, Melissa, any final words before we move on?
I think that some of the key phrases that I've heard are representing people, a variety of different members of our community, visual representation, as well as invisible representation. I'm seeing and hearing the concepts of belonging and trust as being critical, and that our process of relationship building and understanding the context of folks is critical to making sure that we are authentically serving them. And that we have not only what has been behind us and what are we referencing, all of the different intergenerational systemic impacts on the landscape, but also how do we want to intentionally replicate our culture and create what we want in the future to be what is our ideal, as opposed to just blindly replicating what we have been taught. And as we move forward, how are we practicing empathy for serving others in our community, all residents of our community?
Excellent. Way to tie a nice bow on all of that. I appreciate that. Okay, so who is ready to move? Because it is time to head over to the main stage for the Everett High School Dance Company, introduced by Mayor Andy Shore of the City of Lansing. Our Lansing School District students and their coach are going to take us through a movement break until 1:30. So I will see you then at the closing session at 1:30. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye, everyone. Pleasure to meet you.
Bye.
Bye.